Sometimes the best things in life come when you stop looking for them. For 62 years, Sage Montclair had quietly served her mountain community, never asking for recognition, never expecting anything to change. She ran a small general store in Mistwood Ridge, trading supplies with loggers and farmers who passed through. One spring morning, a desperate traveler offered her a deal nobody else would take: good supplies for a skinny grey donkey named Bram. People laughed at her. They called it the worst trade in the valley. But that donkey led Sage to hidden caves filled with valuable minerals that would make her wealthy beyond imagination. The real question was what she would do with that wealth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains around Mistwood Ridge held their breath in the hours before dawn. That's when Sage Montclair loved them most, when the world was still caught between darkness and light, when the lodgepole pines stood like silent sentinels against the fading stars, and when the cold air carried nothing but the promise of another day. She had been waking at 4:30 every morning for 35 years, and the routine had worn itself into her bones like water, carving through stone. Her small cabin sat 100 yards behind the general store, connected by a gravel path she'd walked so many times she could navigate it blind. The floorboards inside creaked in familiar places as she moved through the rooms, lighting the oil lamp in the kitchen first, then the one by the door. The wood stove still held embers from the night before, and she coaxed them back to life with kindling and breath, watching the flames catch and spread. Coffee went into the percolator, the old-fashioned kind that bubbled and hissed on the stovetop, and while it brewed, she pulled on her work clothes, denim pants worn soft at the knees, a flannel shirt that had belonged to her late husband, and boots that had been resoled twice by 5 o'clock. She was crossing the path to the store, her breath making small clouds in the mountain air. The sign above the door read Montclair's Outpost, in hand-carved letters that had weathered to a silvered grey. Her husband had made that sign the year they'd opened, back when their daughter was still in diapers and the future seemed full of possibilities they couldn't quite name. Now the sign hung slightly crooked, had for years, and Sage couldn't bring herself to straighten it. Some things were meant to lean a little. Inside, the store smelled of pine boards, leather, coffee, and the faint sweetness of old tobacco that had seeped into the walls over decades. She lit the lamps one by one, their warm glow pushing back the darkness and revealing shelves stocked with everything a mountain community might need. Canned goods, flour and sugar in large bins, rope and wire, nails and screws in wooden drawers, wool blankets, work gloves, axes and saws, medicines and bandages, tobacco and rolling papers, coffee and tea. The merchandise was practical, honest, necessary, nothing fancy, nothing wasted. The store had been her life's work, built from nothing after her husband died in a logging accident. She'd been 27 then, with a 2-year-old daughter and exactly $400 to her name. People had told her she should move back to the valley, find work in town, maybe remarry. Instead, she'd taken out a loan, bought this building, and learned how to run a business by making every mistake possible and somehow surviving them all. Her daughter had grown up behind this counter, doing homework on slow afternoons, learning to make change before she learned to read properly, falling asleep in the back room while Sage balanced the books late into the night. That daughter was grown now. Married to a mining engineer, living down in Colorado with 2 children Sage saw maybe twice a year. They talked on the phone every Sunday, conversations that were warm but brief, full of updates about soccer games and school projects and the ordinary happenings of a life that felt very far away. Sage was proud of her, truly proud, but there was an emptiness that came with watching your child build a life that didn't need you anymore. Not that she'd ever say such a thing out loud. The first customer usually arrived around 6, right when the coffee was ready. This morning was no different. Sage heard the heavy footsteps on the wooden porch, the familiar pattern of boots that had walked here thousands of times before. And she was already pouring a cup when Virgil Brennan pushed through the door. "Morning, Sage," he said, removing his hat. Virgil was 70 years old, with a face carved by wind and work, white hair that stuck up in odd directions, and hands that were more scar tissue than skin. He'd been logging these mountains for 50 years, starting as a teenager and working his way up to crew boss before age, and changing times had reduced his role to something closer to advisor. He was the closest thing Sage had to a best friend, though neither of them would have used that word. "Morning, Virgil."
Cream and sugar.
"You know I don't take either one. Been asking for 30 years. Figure one day you might change your mind." He smiled at that, a small lifting of weathered features. "When I do, it'll mean I've gone soft. Shoot me if that happens." They settled into their usual spots, Virgil on the stool near the counter, Sage leaning against the shelves behind it. This was their morning ritual, 15 minutes of quiet conversation before the day properly began. They talked about the weather, about who was working where, about the price of timber and the cost of living, and the way things kept changing, whether you wanted them to or not. "Heard the logging company might be cutting back operations," Virgil said, staring into his coffee. "Profit margins too thin, they say. Might mean some of the younger crews get laid off come summer." Sage nodded slowly. She'd heard the same rumors. Mistwood Ridge had always been a logging town, carved out of the wilderness by people who knew how to fall trees and mill lumber and survive on very little. But the big companies kept consolidating, mechanizing, moving operations to wherever the numbers worked best. People here were increasingly seen as expensive, inefficient, outdated. The young folks were leaving for the valley towns, looking for steadier work and easier lives. Those who remained were mostly the older generation, too stubborn or too attached to leave. "How's that affecting you?" she asked. "Still got my pension, such as it is. But I worry about the town. We lose much more population. There won't be enough to keep things running. School's already down to 15 students. Post office barely stays open. And your store—" He stopped, looking uncomfortable. "My store is barely breaking even," Sage finished for him. "I know. Been that way for 3 years now." It was the truth she'd been avoiding saying out loud, but there it was. The store survived on credit as much as cash these days. She extended payment plans to families who couldn't afford to pay up front, or took barter when money was tight. Sometimes just gave things away when she knew someone was really struggling. Her late husband would have called it bad business. Sage called it being human. But being human didn't pay the bills, and the roof needed replacing before next winter. And her savings account was nearly empty. The door opened again, bringing a gust of cold air and Pauline Driscoll, who ran a small farm on the South Ridge with her husband. Pauline was 58, built solid from years of physical labor, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of skeptical assessment. She and Sage had known each other for decades, a relationship built on mutual respect and very little warmth. "Coffee ready?" Pauline asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Always is," Sage replied, pouring a third cup. Pauline took it, added 2 sugars, and leaned against the opposite counter. "Virgil telling you about the layoffs?" "Just mentioned it. Going to hurt everyone. Families that can't buy supplies can't keep me in business either. It's all connected. Everything we do up here. When part fails, the rest starts crumbling." It was a grim assessment, but not inaccurate. Sage had seen it happen to other small towns in these mountains. The slow decline that started with one business closing, then another, then families moving away until only the most stubborn or most trapped remained. She'd always believed Mistwood Ridge would be different, that the community here had deeper roots. But roots needed soil to grow in, and the economic ground kept eroding. They talked a while longer, the conversation circling familiar territory. Who was having trouble? Who might leave? What could be done? The answer to that last question was always nothing, or nothing realistic, nothing that didn't require money or power or influence that none of them possessed. Eventually, Virgil and Pauline left to start their workdays, and Sage was alone again, with the morning light growing stronger outside the windows. She busied herself with the day's tasks, sweeping the floor, restocking shelves, checking inventory against her ledger. The ledger was a thick, leather-bound book. its pages filled with handwritten entries in neat columns. Dates, items, prices, payments received, credit extended. It was a record of 35 years of commerce and compassion, of every transaction that had passed through this store. Sometimes Sage flipped through the old pages and saw the names of people who had died or moved away, saw the careful notations of payments made in installments over months, saw the evidence of a life spent in service to a community that barely noticed she was there. That was the hard truth she'd been living with lately, the sense of being invisible despite being essential. People came to her store every day, relied on her generosity, depended on her presence. But they looked through her as much as at her. She was part of the landscape, like the mountains or the trees, something constant and unchanging and easily taken for granted. When had she last been invited to someone's home for dinner? When had anyone asked her opinion on something that wasn't store-related? When had someone looked at her and seen a person rather than a shopkeeper? Around 8 o'clock, young Henry Cobb came in. He was 28, new to the area, trying to establish himself as an independent timber contractor. He had ambition and energy, but not much experience or capital. Sage had extended him credit for supplies, partly because she believed in helping young people trying to make their way, partly because she remembered being that young person herself. Morning. "Sage," he said with the practiced friendliness of someone who wanted something. "Got a minute to talk?" "Always got time for customers." He shifted his weight, suddenly less comfortable. "Actually, I wanted to talk about the store itself. About maybe buying it." Sage felt something tighten in her chest. "Buying it? I know it's probably not something you've thought about, but hear me out. I've been doing some calculating, and I think there's potential here if it's run a little differently. More focus on timber supplies, less on general goods. Could turn it into a real outfitting operation for logging crews," he went on, explaining his vision, his numbers, his plans. The offer, he mentioned, was low, less than half what the building and land were actually worth, though Sage suspected he didn't know that. He probably thought he was being generous. "I appreciate the thought," she said carefully, "but I'm not looking to sell her. Just think about it. I know things are tight. I've heard people talking. And I'm not saying this to be cruel, but at some point you have to think about your future. You're not getting any younger." There it was, the reminder that she was 62, that she was aging, that eventually this life would end whether she was ready or not. Henry meant well, probably, but the words still stung. After he left, Sage stood at the counter and looked around the store with fresh eyes, trying to see it as an outsider might. The building was old, yes. The merchandise was practical rather than exciting. The profits were thin. But this place was her life's work, the monument to her survival, the proof that she'd built something meaningful from grief and determination. Selling it would be like selling herself. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm, customers coming and going, small purchases and brief conversations, the ordinary commerce of an ordinary day. But something had shifted inside Sage, some awareness she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was Henry's words about her age. Maybe it was the morning's talk about decline and struggle. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of years spent in the same place, doing the same things, being the same person. By noon, she was restocking the nails when she noticed the old stories again, the framed newspaper clippings on the wall near the back. They told the history of Mistwood Ridge, including the brief gold rush of the 1880s that had brought prospectors into these mountains. Most had found nothing and left disappointed. A few had found small deposits that played out quickly. Legend said there were still veins of valuable minerals hidden in the remote peaks, but legend said a lot of things that weren't true. Sage had never given much thought to those old stories. She'd always been too practical for treasure hunting, too focused on the concrete realities of bills and inventory and keeping food on the table. But standing there in the quiet afternoon, looking at those yellowed clippings, she found herself wondering what it would be like to find something extraordinary. To have one moment of pure good fortune after a lifetime of steady work and modest rewards. The thought felt foolish, even as she had it. Treasure was for stories, not for 62-year-old shopkeepers with worn hands and tired backs. Real life was about showing up every day, doing the work, accepting what came. That's what she'd learned over 6 decades. That's what kept people surviving in places like this. Still, when she locked up that evening and walked back to her cabin through the gathering dusk, she found herself looking at the mountains differently. They'd always been beautiful to her, but in a familiar way. Like a face you'd seen so often, you stopped really looking at it. Now she noticed the peaks turning purple in the failing light, the way shadows pooled in the valleys, the mysterious distance of the high ridges where few people ever went. Somewhere in those mountains, the old prospectors had searched for fortune. Somewhere up there, stone held secrets that time hadn't yet revealed. Sage shook her head at her own fancy. She had enough to worry about without adding impossible dreams to the list. Tomorrow would come early, same as always. And the store would need opening, same as always. And life would continue in its predictable patterns, except tomorrow would bring a visitor she wasn't expecting, and a choice she'd never imagined making, and the beginning of a change that would shake every certainty she'd built her life upon. But tonight, she didn't know that yet. Tonight, she just made herself dinner, read a few pages of a book she'd been working through for months, and went to bed with the window open to let in the mountain air. Tomorrow was just tomorrow, nothing more, or so she thought. The next morning arrived cold and bright, with frost silvering the grass and the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Sage opened the store at her usual time, went through her usual routine, and was standing behind the counter reviewing her accounts when she heard something she hadn't expected, the clip-clop of hooves on the packed dirt road. Horses weren't uncommon in Mistwood Ridge, but they were rare enough to draw attention. She looked up from the ledger as a man came into view, leading a grey donkey by a frayed rope halter. The man was thin, perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of gaunt face that spoke of recent hardship. His clothes were dusty and worn, his boots cracked at the seams. The donkey beside him looked even worse, all ribs and rough coat, ears drooping, moving with the resigned slowness of an animal that had given up expecting anything good. The man tied the donkey to the hitching post outside and came in, removing his hat. Up close, Sage could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the desperate edge in his eyes that made her instinctively wary. She'd seen that look before, usually on people who were about to ask for something impossible. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. "Name's Oliver Finch. I'm hoping you might be able to help me." "I'll try." "What do you need?" He glanced around the store, taking inventory of the shelves, calculating something in his head. "I need supplies. Food, mostly. Some rope and maybe a tarp. Problem is, I don't have cash to pay for them." Sage kept her expression neutral. This wasn't the first time someone had come in without money, and she'd developed a practiced response over the years. "I can extend some credit if you're local, but I'll need to know how you're planning to settle up." "I'm not local. Just passing through." He paused, seeming to gather himself for what came next. "But I've got something to trade. That donkey outside. He's worth more than what I need in supplies." Sage glanced through the window at the animal, still standing with its head down, looking like it barely had the energy to breathe. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any use for a donkey. And honestly, that animal looks like it needs a veterinarian more than it needs a new owner. He's just tired from the journey," Oliver said quickly. "Fed him proper, he'd be fine. Strong animal, good temperament, could haul supplies, carry packs. Worth at least $200 to the right person. $200. Sage almost laughed, but she could see the desperation in the man's face and kept her reaction to herself. That donkey wasn't worth $50 in its current condition, and they both probably knew it. "I appreciate the offer, but I really can't. My sister is dying." The words came out flat, without drama, which somehow made them more believable. "Down in the valley, maybe 2 days' travel if I push hard. Got a telegram 3 days ago. She's asking for me, and I've been trying to get there, but my wagon broke an axle yesterday, and I can't fix it without tools I don't have. I need supplies to make the rest of the journey on foot. I need them today, right now. And the only thing I have to trade is that donkey. He stopped, swallowed hard, and Sage saw his hands shaking slightly. This wasn't a con, or if it was the best one she'd ever seen. This was just a man caught in impossible circumstances, trying to reach someone he loved before it was too late. She looked out the window again at the donkey, then back at Oliver, then down at her ledger where the numbers told their own story of tight margins and mounting debts. Taking this trade would be foolish from every practical angle. The donkey would be another mouth to feed, another responsibility she didn't need. She'd probably never recoup even half the value of the supplies she'd give him, but sometimes the right thing and the practical thing weren't the same. Sometimes you just did what was human and let the consequences sort themselves out later. "All right," she heard herself say. "What exactly do you need?" Relief washed over Oliver's face so completely that Sage had to look away from the raw emotion of it. He pulled a crumpled list from his pocket, and they went through it together. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, hardtack, some rope, a canvas tarp, matches. She added items he hadn't thought of: a wool blanket, some basic medicines, extra socks. By the time they'd finished assembling everything, the pile on the counter represented close to $400 worth of merchandise. "That donkey's name is Bram," Oliver said, as Sage packed everything into a sturdy canvas bag. "Don't know how old he is. Had him about 5 years. He's stubborn sometimes, but he's got sense. More sense than most people give him credit for." "I'll keep that in mind." They shook hands, and Oliver loaded up the supplies, testing the weight and redistributing things until he was satisfied he could carry it all. At the door he paused and looked back at her. "You didn't have to do this. Most people wouldn't have." "Get to your sister," Sage said simply. "That's payment enough." After he left, she stood at the window and watched him walk away down the road, moving with renewed purpose despite the heavy load on his back. The donkey, Bram, remained tied to the post, watching his former owner disappear with an expression that might have been resignation or might have been nothing at all. Odd to tell with donkeys, Sage went outside to examine her new acquisition more closely. Up close, the animal looked even worse than from a distance. His coat was dull and patchy, his hooves badly needed trimming, and when she ran her hand along his side, she could count every rib. But his eyes were clear, and when she scratched behind his ears, he leaned into it slightly. The first sign of life she'd seen from him. "Well, Bram," she said quietly, "I guess we're stuck with each other now." The store door banged open behind her and Pauline came out, coffee cup in hand, having apparently arrived while Sage was doing the trade. She took one look at the donkey and shook her head. "Please tell me you didn't actually trade supplies for that thing. His name is Bram. I don't care if his name is Secretariat." "That is the sorriest excuse for a donkey I've ever seen." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking a man needed help getting to his dying sister, and now you've got a half-dead donkey eating feed you can't afford." "Sage, I know you've got a good heart, but this is just—" She stopped, searching for words. "This is foolish. There's being generous, and then there's being taken advantage of." Before Sage could respond, Virgil appeared, drawn by the commotion. He walked a slow circle around Bram, his experienced logger's eye assessing the animal with professional detachment. "How much you give for him?" he asked. $400 in supplies." Virgil winced. "That's rough." "In his current state, I wouldn't pay 50. You got taken, Sage. No kind way to say it. More people started gathering, drawn by the unusual sight of Sage with a donkey. The story spread quickly. She'd made a trade, a bad one, given away hundreds of dollars of supplies for an animal that looked ready for the glue factory. Some people looked sympathetic, others seemed amused. A few appeared genuinely concerned, as if this were evidence that she was losing her grip on reality. Henry Cobb showed up, looking at the donkey with undisguised contempt. "This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday. No business sense. You can't run a store on feelings, Sage. At some point, you have to make smart decisions. The man needed help, and now you need help. How's that roof getting fixed? How are you keeping the lights on when you're giving away your inventory?" It went on like that for an hour, people offering opinions she hadn't asked for, telling her what she should have done, what she ought to do now. The worst part was knowing they were probably right. This had been a foolish trade by any objective measure. She'd let compassion override common sense. And now she'd be the one paying the price. Finally, everyone dispersed back to their own lives and responsibilities, leaving Sage alone with Bram and the echo of their judgment. She untied him and led him around back where there was an old lean-to that would serve as temporary shelter. She found some hay she'd been using as packing material, filled a bucket with water, and watched as he ate and drank with the focused intensity of an animal who'd been deprived too long. "Guess we're both the subject of gossip now," she told him. The foolish woman and the worthless donkey. But as she stood there in the afternoon sun, watching Bram methodically work through the hay, she found she didn't regret the trade. Maybe that made her a bad business person. Maybe it proved she was too soft for the harsh realities of commerce. But she'd helped someone reach a dying family member, and that had to count for something, even if it didn't show up in any ledger. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Bram carried his own history, his own knowledge, his own peculiar purpose. Oliver's parting words had been more than just description. They'd been warning and prophecy both. The donkey had more sense than most people gave him credit for, and in the days ahead, that sense would lead Sage to places she'd never imagined, to discoveries that would change everything, and to choices that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone in Mistwood Ridge. But first, the donkey needed to rest. And so did she. For the first 3 days, Bram did nothing but eat, drink, and sleep. Sage tended him carefully, giving him small amounts of feed at regular intervals, not wanting to overwhelm a system that had clearly been pushed to its limits. She cleaned his hooves, brushed his coat, and spoke to him in the quiet way you'd talk to anyone who'd been through something difficult. The animal accepted her care with patient stillness, those clear eyes watching her with what seemed like understanding. By the 4th day, he'd put on a little weight and started showing more energy. That's when the strange behavior began. Sage came out after breakfast to find him pacing along the fence line at the back of the property, walking back and forth with obvious purpose, stopping at the northeast corner to stare up at the mountain ridge. When she approached, he turned to look at her, then back at the ridge, then at her again. "What's got your attention up there?" she asked. Bram walked to the gate and pushed against it with his nose, not frantically, but with clear intent. When Sage didn't respond, he did it again, then looked back at her with an expression she could only describe as expectant. "You want to go for a walk?" The donkey's ears perked forward. Sage laughed despite herself. She had work to do. The store would need opening soon. There were deliveries to sort through, accounts to update. But something about the animal's insistence tugged at her curiosity. What harm could come from a short walk before starting the day? She found a rope in the shed, fashioned a makeshift lead, and opened the gate. Bram immediately started walking northeast, not hurrying but moving with clear direction, like someone following a path they'd traveled before. Sage followed, bemused and increasingly curious. The terrain grew steeper as they left the cleared area around town. This wasn't country Sage explored often. Too rocky, too remote, too far from the established trails the loggers used. The pines grew thick here, their roots gripping the rocky soil, and the morning mist still clung to the low places. Bram moved through it all with surprising confidence for an animal who'd supposedly never been here before. After about 40 minutes of climbing, he stopped at a spot where the trees thinned and an outcrop of grey stone pushed through the earth. To Sage, it looked like every other rocky formation in these mountains. But Bram approached it carefully, sniffing at the ground, pawing at a particular spot where loose soil had collected against the stone. Sage crouched down to see what had caught his attention. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then, brushing away the dirt, her fingers touched something metal. She dug deeper and pulled out a rusted pickaxe, its wooden handle mostly rotted away, but the iron head still intact. The design was old, decades old, maybe longer. She turned it over in her hands, her heart beating a little faster. Someone had used this here a long time ago. Someone had been digging or mining or searching for something, looking more carefully at the outcrop. She noticed what she'd missed before, marks in the stone, subtle but deliberate, showing where tools had struck rock. Not random damage, purposeful excavation, and just behind the outcrop, partially hidden by fallen branches and undergrowth, was a dark opening in the mountainside. A cave entrance, or more accurately, the entrance to what had once been a mine shaft. Sage stood there holding the rusty pickaxe, looking at that dark opening, and felt something shift in her understanding of the world. The old newspaper stories weren't just legends. People had actually mined these mountains, had actually searched these remote places for minerals and metals and whatever else the earth might hold. But why here specifically? What had drawn the old prospectors to this particular spot? And more importantly, how had Bram known to lead her here? She glanced at the donkey, who was now munching contentedly on some mountain grass, appearing completely unconcerned with the mystery he'd just revealed. Oliver's words came back to her. He's got more sense than most people give him credit for. What had Oliver known? What had he not said? The cave entrance beckoned, but Sage wasn't foolish enough to enter an old mine shaft alone and unprepared. These places could be unstable, full of hidden drops or bad air or any number of dangers. She'd need a proper lamp, rope, someone who knew what they were doing, but she could at least look inside from the entrance. She approached carefully, testing each step, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. The opening was narrow but tall enough to walk through. Just inside, out of the weather, she could make out more evidence of human activity, tool marks on the walls, places where rock had been deliberately broken away. And beyond that, fading into shadow, the shaft seemed to continue deeper into the mountain. Something glinted in the dim light. Sage knelt down and picked up a small fragment of rock that had broken off from the wall. Even in the poor light, she could see crystals embedded in the stone, catching what little illumination reached this far. They sparkled with an internal fire, unlike anything she'd seen in ordinary rocks. She put the fragment in her pocket, then collected 2 more samples from different places near the entrance. These she'd need to examine properly, maybe show to someone who knew about such things. But even without expertise, she could tell these weren't common stones. The sound of branches cracking made her turn sharply. But it was just Bram, who'd wandered over and was now standing at the cave entrance, blocking most of the light, looking at her with what seemed like approval. "Did Oliver train you to lead someone here?" she asked quietly. "Is that what this is about?" The donkey naturally offered no answer, but his calm presence was reassuring as Sage's mind raced through possibilities and questions. If there were valuable minerals here, if this was more than just an abandoned prospect hole, then she'd stumbled onto something significant. But she needed to be careful, needed to be smart, needed to verify what she'd found before telling anyone, because if word got out that she'd discovered mineral deposits, everything would change. People would swarm over this mountain. Companies would come with lawyers and contracts. Her quiet life would explode into chaos, and there was still the question of ownership. This was public land, technically, but there were old mining claims in these mountains, some of which might still have legal weight. If Oliver had known about this place, if he'd deliberately traded Bram to lead someone here, then he might have his own claim to whatever was found. The whole thing was complicated and potentially dangerous, and Sage realized she was completely out of her depth. She was a shopkeeper, not a prospector. She knew inventory and credit and how to read people who came through her door. She didn't know the first thing about mining law or mineral assessment or any of the technical knowledge she'd suddenly need. They made their way back down the mountain, Sage moving carefully with her precious pocket samples and the old pickaxe. Bram followed along, placid and patient, acting like he'd done nothing more remarkable than take a morning stroll. Back at the store, Sage hid the pickaxe in her cabin and put the rock samples in an old tobacco tin she kept in the back room. She went through the motions of opening for business, serving customers, making conversation. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities, trying to figure out her next move. At noon, when the store was empty, she pulled out an old geology textbook she'd found at a yard sale years ago. She'd bought it on a whim, thinking her daughter might be interested. Now she flipped through it, looking for anything that might help her identify what she'd found. The crystals in her samples looked similar to illustrations of zeolites, a family of minerals that formed in volcanic rock, often valuable for industrial uses, sometimes worth significant money if the quality was right. But she couldn't be certain without proper testing. She needed expert advice. But asking the wrong person could spread the word before she was ready. She needed someone discreet, someone passing through, someone with no connection to Mistwood Ridge. And then, as if the universe had heard her thought, she saw through the window a vehicle she didn't recognize, a truck with official markings from the State Geological Survey. A man got out, stretched, and started toward the store. Sometimes fortune arrived when you weren't looking for it. Sometimes it came disguised as a stranger who needed coffee and happened to know about rocks. The geologist's name was Marcus Webb, and he was in his mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. He ordered coffee and a sandwich, then spread a topographical map across the counter while he ate, marking locations with a pencil and muttering notes to himself. Sage refilled his coffee and took a chance. You mapping mineral deposits? Survey work. State wants updated records of geological features in this region, mostly just cataloging what's already known, but occasionally we find something interesting. He looked up at her with the friendly curiosity of someone who enjoyed talking about his work. You've lived here long? 35 years. Ever heard stories about mining in these mountains? Old prospector tales, abandoned claims, that sort of thing. This was it, the opening she needed. Sage kept her voice casual. There's old newspaper articles about a minor gold rush in the 1880s. Most of the prospectors left empty-handed, but I've always wondered if there might be other minerals up there that they weren't looking for. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly right. The old-timers were focused on gold and silver, maybe copper. They would have ignored zeolites, rare earth elements, even certain gemstones that weren't valued back then. Modern industry needs different things than Victorian prospectors cared about. Zeolites, Sage repeated carefully. Those are valuable now. Can be, depending on quality and quantity. Used in water filtration, petrochemical processing, even in agriculture. A good zeolite deposit could be worth significant money. Why do you ask? Sage made her decision. She pulled out the tobacco tin from under the counter and set it between them. I found these. Wondered if they might be interesting. Marcus set down his coffee and picked up the first sample, turning it over in his hands. His expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention. He pulled a small magnifying loupe from his pocket and examined the crystals more closely. Then he looked at the second sample and the third. Where exactly did you find these? Northeast Ridge, maybe an hour's hike. There's an old mine entrance, abandoned. These were just loose on the ground inside. Just loose on the ground, Marcus repeated slowly. He set the samples down and looked at her directly. Ma'am, I don't want to get your hopes up unnecessarily, but these look like high-quality clinoptilolite. That's a type of zeolite. If these came from a larger deposit, if there's more where you found these, this could be extremely valuable. Sage's heart was racing, but she kept her voice steady. How valuable? Depends on the size of the deposit and the purity, but we're potentially talking about minerals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. I'd need to do proper testing, take more samples, survey the whole area. He paused. This is public land? Yes. Then you'd need to file a mining claim. There's a process, legal requirements. But if you're the one who discovered it, you'd have the right to claim it first. He pulled out a business card. Listen, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm supposed to be impartial, but you seem like good people. If you want this tested properly, send samples to this lab in Denver. They're honest, thorough, and they're used to handling sensitive discoveries discreetly. Discreetly? Word gets out about a significant find. You'll have people crawling all over your mountain before you've had time to secure your rights. File the claim first, verify what you've got, then make decisions about what to do. In that order, he finished his lunch, paid his bill, and gave her detailed instructions about how to collect proper samples, how to document the location, what paperwork she'd need. Before he left, he looked at her seriously. "One more thing. If this is what I think it is, your life is about to get complicated. Companies will come with money and lawyers. People you've known for years will suddenly have opinions about how you should handle it. Be very careful who you trust." After he drove away, Sage stood behind the counter, holding his business card, feeling like she'd just been handed a map to a treasure she wasn't sure she wanted to find. The samples sat in their tin, innocent-looking fragments of rock that might represent a fortune. She spent the next 2 weeks making careful trips up to the cave with Bram, collecting samples from different locations, documenting everything in a notebook she kept hidden in her cabin. The donkey seemed to understand the need for secrecy. He'd walk the trail calmly, stand guard while she worked, and never made a fuss that might draw attention. The cave system was larger than she'd initially thought. The main shaft went back about 50 feet before branching into 2 smaller tunnels. The walls throughout showed signs of zeolite deposits, those distinctive crystals, catching the light from her lantern, embedded in volcanic rock just like the textbook had shown. In some places, the concentration was so dense that entire sections of wall glittered like a strange underground galaxy. She collected 24 samples total, carefully labeled and wrapped, and sent them to the Denver lab with instructions for a comprehensive analysis. The wait would be 3 weeks, they told her. 3 weeks before she'd know if this was real, or just another false hope in a life that had taught her not to hope too much. During those weeks, keeping the secret became its own form of torture. Every time Virgil asked her why she seemed distracted, every time Pauline made a comment about the donkey, every time Henry Cobb came in with his persistent offers to buy the store, Sage had to smile and deflect and pretend everything was normal, but nothing was normal anymore. She'd lie awake at night, imagining what she'd do if the minerals turned out to be valuable. Pay off her debts, obviously. Fix the roof. Maybe take a real vacation for the first time in 35 years. Beyond that, her imagination failed her. What did wealth even look like for someone like her? The store continued its slow decline. A major logging crew got laid off, meaning 5 families suddenly tightening their belts, buying less, asking for more credit Sage couldn't really afford to extend. The roof leak got worse. She had to put buckets out when it rained. Henry's offers got more insistent, his tone edging toward impatience. One evening, Pauline came by after closing and found Sage sitting on the porch with Bram, just watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. "You've been different lately," Pauline said without preamble. "Distracted, secretive. That donkey got you taking night walks, I've noticed. Just trying to get him exercised and healthy." Pauline sat down on the steps. "Known you a long time, Sage. Long enough to see when something's weighing on you. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." It was the kindest thing Pauline had said to her in years, maybe ever. Sage felt the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs, wanting to be shared. But Marcus had been clear. "Tell no one until the claim was filed and the tests were back. I appreciate that. Really. But some things you have to figure out by yourself." Pauline nodded slowly. "All right. But when you're ready to talk, I'm here. Might surprise you." After she left, Sage continued sitting there as the light faded and the stars came out. Bram stood nearby, occasionally shifting weight, comfortable in the silence. "What am I supposed to do if this is real?" she asked him quietly. "I've spent 35 years being invisible, being the person nobody notices. What happens when suddenly everyone's paying attention?" The donkey, as always, kept his counsel, but his presence was steadying, like an anchor in a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The test results came back on a Tuesday morning, in a plain envelope addressed to her personally. Sage made herself wait until after breakfast, until after opening the store, until after her hands stopped shaking enough to hold the papers steady. Then she read them. Read them again! Read them a third time to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. The zeolite deposits were genuine. High quality, extensive. Worth, according to the conservative estimate provided by the lab, somewhere between $2 and $4 million. Depending on extraction costs and market conditions, $2 to $4 million. Sage sat down hard on the stool behind the counter, the paper fluttering from her fingers to land on the scarred wooden surface. Everything was about to change. Everything. Sage spent the entire day in a state of shock. She served customers without really seeing them, made change automatically, smiled and nodded at conversations she didn't hear. The paper with its impossible numbers stayed in her pocket, burning like a brand against her hip. $2 to $4 million. The words didn't make sense. They belonged to a different world, a different kind of person. Not to a 62-year-old woman whose greatest achievement had been keeping a store open through 3 decades of scraping by. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the lab reports spread out in front of her, along with the forms for filing a mining claim that Marcus had told her about. The paperwork was complicated. Declarations of discovery, descriptions of the claim boundaries, affidavits about property rights. She worked through it methodically, the same way she taught herself bookkeeping and business management years ago, one step at a time, checking each detail twice. By midnight, the forms were completed. By dawn, she'd hiked back up to the cave to verify the boundary markers she'd placed. By mid-morning, she was at the county office filing the claim officially. The clerk processed the paperwork without interest or comment. Just another form in an endless stream of bureaucracy. He had no idea he was recording the moment Sage Montclair's life split into before and after. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt terrified. The secret couldn't last. Somehow word would leak. Someone would notice her trips up the mountain, would ask the right questions, would piece things together. And then what? How did you protect something this valuable? How did you make decisions about something this far outside your experience? The answer came the following week in the form of 3 men in expensive suits driving an SUV with Colorado plates. They walked into her store with the easy confidence of people who were used to getting what they wanted. Miss Montclair. The lead man offered his hand. "I'm Richard Banks with Titan Resources. We've heard you might have discovered something interesting up in these mountains. We'd like to discuss a potential business arrangement." Sage's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Ma'am, with respect, we know about the mining claim you filed last week. It's public record. We know about the zeolite deposits. We'd like to make you an offer before anyone else gets the chance. So much for discretion. So much for time to think." The machinery of commerce had found her discovery. And now there were men in suits talking about offers and arrangements and business deals she didn't understand. They spread papers across her counter, technical assessments, profit projections, contract terms. The offer was substantial. $300,000 up front, plus a small percentage of future mining revenue. They called it generous. They called it fair. They said they'd handle everything. Extraction, processing, environmental compliance, all the complicated details she'd never figure out on her own. "We'd need an answer soon," Banks said. "There are other interested parties. We're prepared to give you 48 hours to decide." After they left, Sage stood in the empty store and felt the walls closing in. $300,000. It was more money than she'd earned in 10 years of running the store. It would solve every financial problem she had. But something about the whole encounter felt wrong. The pressure tactics, the tight deadline, the way they'd made her feel stupid for not understanding their technical language. She called the number on Marcus Webb's business card. He answered on the 3rd ring. "They lowballed you," he said flatly after she'd explained the offer. "Significantly. If the deposit is as extensive as your claim suggests, the minerals are worth millions, not hundreds of thousands. They're hoping you'll take the quick money because you don't know any better. Then what should I do?" "Get a lawyer. A good one, who specializes in mining law. Don't sign anything until you've had independent assessment and legal counsel. And be prepared for this to get complicated. Once word spreads, and it will, you're going to have companies competing for access to that deposit. Some will play fair, others won't." Sage thanked him and hung up, then sat down heavily. A lawyer would cost money she didn't have. The complications Marcus warned about were already starting. And she still had to run a store, still had to pay bills, still had to get through each day, while her entire world transformed around her. The next morning, Virgil came in for his usual coffee and found her looking haggard from lack of sleep. "What's wrong?" he asked directly. "And don't tell me nothing. I've known you too long," so she told him. Not everything, but the essentials, the discovery, the claim, the company that had come calling. She watched his weathered face process the information, saw surprise give way to concern. How much did they offer? 300,000, he whistled low. "That's a lot of money. The geologist says it's not enough, says I'm being manipulated." Virgil was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "You know what happens when something like this comes to light? When there's real money involved? It changes people, brings out the worst in some, the best in others. You're going to need help navigating this, Sage. Can't do it alone. I don't even know who to trust. You trust yourself. You've got good instincts. Use them." He paused. "And you trust people who've been straight with you over the years, who've shown you who they really are when there wasn't money on the table." It was good advice, but it didn't make the fear any less. Over the next few days, word spread through Mistwood Ridge like wildfire. Sage had discovered minerals. Sage was going to be rich. Sage was sitting on millions, while the rest of them struggled. The story changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic, more simplified, more removed from the complicated truth. People she'd known for decades suddenly had opinions. Some were happy for her, genuinely pleased that someone decent had caught a break. Others were resentful, as if her good fortune had somehow come at their expense. A few made pointed comments about how she'd been extending credit to people, how maybe she'd known all along she didn't need to worry about money, how maybe she'd been playing them for fools. Pauline surprised her by being firmly supportive. "Don't let them make you feel guilty," she said, when she found Sage dealing with a particularly nasty comment from one of the loggers. "You didn't steal anything. You found something on public land and filed a legal claim. That's how it works. I'm not trying to, I never wanted to." "I know. That's why you're struggling with this. Because you're thinking about everyone else instead of taking care of yourself. But here's the truth. If any of them had found those minerals, they'd have done the same thing. Probably with less agonizing." Henry Cobb's reaction was the most troubling. He came in with barely concealed anger, his usual friendly demeanor stripped away. "So you knew," he said. "When I offered to buy this place, when I told you to think about the future, you already knew about the minerals. I didn't. The discovery came after your offer. Convenient timing. It's the truth." He leaned across the counter, his face hard. "You've made me look like a fool, Sage. I've been telling people I was going to buy this property, build a real business here. Now they're laughing at me, saying I missed the opportunity of a lifetime because I didn't know what was right under my nose. That's not my fault, isn't it? You could have sold to me, could have given someone else a chance. Instead, you're sitting on millions, while the rest of us scramble for scraps." After he left, Sage realized she was shaking. The encounter had been openly hostile, almost threatening, and it was going to get worse. As more companies came calling, as the potential value became clearer, people would divide themselves into camps, those who supported her and those who thought she owed them something. That night, she sat with Bram in the lean-to behind the store, drawing comfort from his calm presence. "You knew this would happen," she told him. "That's why Oliver traded you, not just to lead me to the minerals, but because he knew I'd need company through whatever came next." The donkey rested his head against her shoulder, warm and solid, and Sage let herself cry for the first time since this had all begun. Cried for the loss of her simple life, for the friendships that were already fracturing, for the impossible burden of wealth she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to manage. But crying didn't solve anything. Eventually, she dried her eyes, locked up the store, and went back to her cabin, where the stack of paperwork waited. Contracts to review, lawyers to contact, decisions to make. The worst part was still ahead of her. The real test wasn't whether she could handle being rich. It was whether she could survive the journey from poor to rich without losing everything that mattered. Sage. found a lawyer through Marcus Webb's recommendation, a woman named Teresa Kim, who specialized in mining rights and had a reputation for protecting individual claimants against corporate pressure. Their first phone call lasted 2 hours and cost $400 Sage could barely afford. But by the end of it, she understood the landscape she was navigating, the difference between selling outright, leasing mining rights, or developing the deposit independently. Each option had advantages and risks, and none of them were simple. "The offer from Titan Resources is insulting," Teresa said bluntly. "Based on your lab reports and claim dimensions, you're sitting on something worth at least $3 million, possibly 6 or 7, depending on market conditions and extraction efficiency. They're betting you'll take the immediate cash because you're scared or overwhelmed. I am scared and overwhelmed. I know. That's normal. But don't make permanent decisions from a temporary emotional state. Give me 2 weeks to do proper due diligence, assess all your options, and we'll develop a strategy that protects your interests." 2 weeks sounded reasonable until Sage realized what that meant. 2 more weeks of pressure, rumors, and escalating tension in a town that was already fracturing along fault lines of resentment and greed. More companies arrived, each with their own pitch. Some were straightforward about wanting to extract the minerals as quickly and cheaply as possible. Others talked about environmental responsibility and community partnerships, while their contracts contained clauses that would effectively hand over all control. One representative implied that without corporate backing, Sage would be vulnerable to legal challenges and claim jumping, thinly veiled threats wrapped in friendly concern. Through it all, Sage kept the store running. It was the only thing that felt normal, the only routine that hadn't been poisoned by the discovery. But even here, the pressure followed her. Customers who'd been friendly for years now looked at her differently. Some were openly hostile, like they blamed her for their own struggles. Others were calculating, suddenly interested in her opinions and her company in ways they'd never been before. The worst were the ones who felt entitled. People she'd helped over the years, who'd bought supplies on credit or received extra when times were tight, now came in expecting to be repaid in the form of cash gifts or investments in their businesses. When Sage tried to explain that she didn't have access to money yet, that nothing had been decided, they looked at her like she was lying or being selfish. One morning, a logger named Tom Pritchard confronted her directly. "You gave me credit for 18 months when I was out of work," he said. "Kept me fed, kept my family going. Now you're sitting on millions, and I'm still breaking my back for $16 an hour. Doesn't that seem wrong to you?" "Tom, I don't have any money yet. I haven't sold anything or leased anything. All I have is a claim and a lot of pressure, but you will have money. And when you do, I expect you to remember who stood by you. I helped you because it was right, not because I expected something back. Yeah, well, maybe I helped you by being a loyal customer all these years, by choosing to shop here instead of driving to the valley. Seems like loyalty should flow both ways." After he left, Sage realized the fundamental shift that had occurred. Before the discovery, her generosity had been seen as exactly that. Generosity freely given, with no strings attached. Now it was being reframed as investment, as debt, as obligation. Every kindness she'd shown was being totaled up as something owed. Virgil came by that evening and found her sitting in the closed store, staring at the ledger without really seeing it. "Heard about Tom," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "Word travels. Everyone thinks I owe them something. Some people think that. Not everyone. Problem is, the angry voices always sound louder than the reasonable ones. What am I supposed to do? I can't give money to every person I've ever helped. Even if I wanted to, even if I could afford it, where would it end? And I don't even have the money yet. I might never have it if this all falls apart." Virgil was quiet for a moment, then said something that cut through all the noise. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not about what you owe people. It's about what kind of person you want to be with this opportunity. What matters to you beyond the money itself." The insight hit her hard because he was right. She'd been so focused on defending herself, on explaining why she didn't owe everyone a piece of her discovery, that she'd stopped thinking about what she actually wanted to do with it. what purpose this wealth could serve beyond just making her personally comfortable. That night, she couldn't sleep. She got up around 2 in the morning and went out to sit with Bram, letting her mind wander through possibilities. If she had money, real money, transformative money, what would she actually want to change? The store could be expanded, properly renovated, but that was small thinking. The whole town was struggling. Young people were leaving, families were barely holding on. The logging company was cutting back, and when that industry finally collapsed completely, Mistwood Ridge would become a ghost town within a decade. But what if there was a way to use the mineral discovery to revitalize the whole community? Not through handouts, but through strategic investment. Creating jobs, supporting local businesses, building infrastructure that would attract new families and new opportunities. The idea felt audacious and possibly naive, but it also felt right in a way that simply cashing out never had. Over the next few days, Sage started sketching out a vision. She talked to Virgil about it, then cautiously to Pauline. She called Teresa Kim and asked about legal structures for community development trusts. She started imagining a different kind of future, one where the mineral wealth became a rising tide that lifted everyone, not just her. But sharing that vision made her vulnerable. Not everyone wanted collective prosperity. Some people preferred the simpler equation of individual fortune. Henry Cobb was the most vocal opponent when he heard about her emerging plans. "You're being manipulated," he told her during a confrontation at the store. "People are making you feel guilty, so you'll share what's rightfully yours. You found the minerals. You took the risk. Why should everyone else benefit? Because this community supported me for 35 years, and you supported them right back. You don't owe anybody anything extra. Take the money, Sage. Secure your future. Stop trying to save everyone." He wasn't wrong about the manipulation. Some people were absolutely trying to guilt her into sharing, but he was also missing something essential. She didn't want to be the wealthy woman in a dying town. She wanted to be part of a community that thrived together, or not at all. That philosophical divide ran through every conversation she had now. Those who believed in individual success versus those who believed in collective welfare. Those who thought she should maximize her personal gain versus those who thought she had an obligation to help others. There was no simple answer, no position that wouldn't leave someone angry, and underneath all of it, a darker current was building. She started noticing her store had been broken into. Nothing taken, but things moved, papers rifled through. Her truck's tires were slashed one night. Someone spray-painted "Share the Wealth" on the side of her cabin. Virgil came by the morning after the graffiti appeared, his face grim. "This is getting dangerous. You need to think about security. Maybe even about leaving town temporarily until things calm down." "I can't leave. The store doesn't matter if you get hurt. And there are people here angry enough, desperate enough, that they might do something stupid. Who? Do you know who's behind this?" "I have suspicions, but no proof. And that's the problem. The anger is spreading, getting less focused. It's not just one person or one group. It's a general sentiment that you're holding something that should be shared. And the more you resist, the more hostile it gets." Sage realized then how completely the situation had deteriorated. 2 months ago, she'd been invisible and respected. Now she was visible and resented. The wealth she hadn't yet received had already cost her the peaceful life she'd built. That evening, she drafted a letter to the community, an explanation of her thinking, her emerging plans for community investment, her desire to find a solution that helped everyone. She planned to post it at the store, at the post office, anywhere people might see it and understand she wasn't their enemy. But before she could distribute it, something happened that changed everything again. Changed it in a way she'd never anticipated, never imagined possible. Oliver Finch came back to town, and with him came a revelation that would reframe everything she thought she understood about Bram, the minerals and the trade that had started it all. Oliver Finch walked into Sage's store on a Thursday morning, looking healthier than he had 2 months ago, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical condition. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if gathering courage, then approached the counter. "I owe you an explanation," he said without preamble. "And an apology." Sage felt her heart sink. She'd known something was off about the original trade, had suspected Bram's behavior wasn't natural, but hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting. The donkey was trained," she said flatly. "Yes, but it's more complicated than that." Oliver pulled an old photograph from his pocket and laid it on the counter. It showed a young man standing in front of a mine entrance, pickaxe in hand. The date, 1883, written in faded ink at the bottom. "This is my grandfather, Benjamin Finch. He was one of the prospectors who came here during the mining rush." Sage picked up the photograph, studying the determined face of the young man. "I thought most of them left empty-handed." "Most did. But my grandfather found something. A deposit of minerals he didn't recognize and couldn't identify with the knowledge of that time. He filed a claim, worked it for a few months, then got sick. By the time he recovered, the rush was over. He'd run out of money and he couldn't afford to develop the claim. He left, intending to come back someday when he had resources. He never did." Oliver pulled out more documents, yellowed papers, old claim forms, letters written in careful script. The story they told was one of deferred dreams and missed opportunities, of a discovery that had languished for over a century while the world changed around it. Before he died, my grandfather told my father about the deposit, described its location, said it would be valuable someday when people learned what those minerals could do. My father told me the same story before he passed. "I've spent 20 years trying to figure out how to access it legally. Why didn't you just file your own claim?" "Because the original claim lapsed decades ago. The land reverted to public status. Under current law, whoever discovers minerals on public land and files a claim has the rights, even if someone else found it first 100 years ago. I couldn't just walk up there and restart my grandfather's work without proof of continuous ownership, which I don't have." Sage was beginning to understand the shape of his plan. "So you trained a donkey to lead someone else to the discovery." "I trained Bram to follow a specific route, to respond to certain cues, to lead someone up to that cave. I chose you because—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Because I watched you for a few weeks before approaching. Saw how you ran your store, how you treated people. I needed someone who would actually file a claim and develop it properly, not just sell it off to the first mining company that came along. Someone who'd do right by the discovery. And you thought you could then claim a share based on your grandfather's original work." "Yes, I hoped that if I presented the historical documentation, proved my family's connection to the original discovery, that we could work out some kind of partnership. That you'd see the fairness in recognizing my grandfather's work, even if the legal claim had expired." Sage sat down heavily on the stool, processing this. The trade that everyone had called foolish had actually been a calculated manipulation. Oliver had deliberately created the circumstances that led to her discovery, banking on her compassion and character to build a situation he could exploit. "Your sister," she said. "Was she really dying?" Oliver's face crumpled slightly. "Yes, that part was absolutely true. I was desperate to reach her, and I didn't have supplies or money. Everything I told you was real. I also knew that trading Bram to you might lead to this opportunity. I was using a real crisis to set up a calculated plan. I'm not proud of it, but you came back." Why tell me any of this?" "Because I've been hearing what's happening in this town. The anger, the accusations, people saying you're greedy or that you're manipulating them. And I realized that by not being honest about my role, I was making everything worse. You're being judged for something I set in motion. That's not right." He pulled out one more document, a legal paper prepared by an attorney. "This is a formal recognition that you're the legitimate discoverer and claimant of the mineral deposit. That my grandfather's expired claim gives me no legal right to any portion of it. I'm signing away any potential challenge to your ownership." Sage stared at the document, then at Oliver, trying to understand his angle. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing. Or nothing legally binding. But if you decide to move forward with development, if there are jobs or opportunities created, I'd like to be considered. I'm a good worker. I know the history of these mountains, and I could be useful. Not as an owner or partner, just as someone who'd like to be part of finishing what my grandfather started. It was manipulative and honest at the same time. He was renouncing legal claims while making an emotional appeal, giving up power while asking for consideration. Sage couldn't tell if it was cynical or sincere. Maybe it was both. Before she could respond, the store door banged open, and Henry Cobb walked in, saw Oliver, and stopped dead. "You," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You're the one who traded her that donkey." "I am. You knew about the minerals. You set this whole thing up." Oliver didn't deny it. "I did." Henry turned to Sage, his face flushed. "See, this proves it. The whole thing was a scam from the beginning. She didn't discover anything. She was led to it, manipulated into it. That changes everything about who has rights to what." "Actually, it doesn't," Sage said quietly. "The law is clear. Whoever files a claim on a genuine discovery has the rights, regardless of how they learned about the location. Oliver just confirmed that in writing. That's not fair. Since when do you care about fair?" The words came out sharper than Sage intended, but weeks of pressure had worn down her patience. "You've been pressuring me to sell, questioning my judgment, implying I owe you something. And now you're upset because someone else had a plan." "Henry, everyone's had a plan for my discovery except me." Henry's expression darkened. "You've changed. Money hasn't even reached your account yet, and you're already different, harder, more suspicious." "No. I've just finally started seeing clearly. And what I see is that this town has spent 35 years taking me for granted. Now there's the possibility of wealth, and suddenly everyone has opinions about what I should do, who I should be, what I owe. We stood by you, and I stood by all of you. I extended credit when people couldn't pay. I gave away supplies when families were struggling. I kept this store open through years of barely breaking even because this community needed it. Don't talk to me about who owes what." The outburst left her shaking. She'd never spoken to anyone in town that way, never pushed back so directly. But something had broken loose inside her. All the resentment and hurt she'd been swallowing, all the pressure she'd been absorbing without complaint. Henry stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. The door slammed behind him, rattling the windows. In the silence that followed, Oliver spoke carefully. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause this much chaos. You didn't cause it. You just revealed it. All of this, the anger, the accusations, the entitlement, it was always there. The minerals just brought it to the surface." Sage looked at the documents spread across her counter, Oliver's historical papers, his legal renunciation, the photograph of a young man who'd found something valuable and never got to benefit from it. And she thought about what Virgil had said. The question wasn't what she owed people, but what kind of person she wanted to be with this opportunity. "Here's what I'm going to do," she said, the decision forming as she spoke. "I'm going to develop this deposit in a way that benefits the whole community. Not through handouts, but through genuine economic development. A community trust that creates jobs, supports local businesses, invests in infrastructure. Anyone who wants to participate will have the opportunity to work for it, to contribute to it, to be part of building something real. That's ambitious. It's also right. My grandfather, he was a logger who died young in an accident that could have been prevented with better equipment. My husband died the same way. This town has been sacrificing its people for timber company profits for 100 years. Maybe it's time we built something different. Something that actually values the people who live here." Oliver nodded slowly. "And me? You get considered for work like everyone else? No special treatment, but no punishment either. Fair evaluation based on what you can contribute. I can live with that." After he left, Sage stood in the empty store and felt the weight of what she'd just committed to. Building a community development trust would be complicated, contentious, and probably the hardest thing she'd ever attempted. It would mean more lawyers, more meetings, more people questioning her judgment. But it also felt true in a way nothing else had since this whole situation began. The discovery wasn't just about minerals or money. It was about choosing what kind of place Mistwood Ridge would become. What kind of community could be built from the ashes of the old extractive economy. And most importantly, it was about whether one person's good fortune could become everyone's opportunity, not through charity, but through genuine partnership and shared purpose. The path forward wouldn't be easy. But at least now she knew which direction she was walking. The idea of a community trust sounded noble in principle. Making it real proved to be an entirely different challenge. Sage spent 3 days locked in her cabin with Teresa Kim, who'd driven up from Denver with a colleague who specialized in cooperative economic structures. They worked through models, legal frameworks, and financial projections until Sage's head spun with terminology she barely understood. But slowly, a plan took shape. The Mistwood Ridge Community Trust would control the mineral rights. Instead of leasing to a single corporation, they'd contract with a mining company for extraction services while maintaining ownership and control. Profits would flow into the trust, which would be governed by an elected board of community members. Revenue would fund 3 primary objectives: job creation, local business development, and infrastructure investment. "It's ambitious," Teresa said, reviewing the final draft. "And it's going to face opposition. Companies will offer you more money for a straight sale. People who want immediate cash payments will resent the longer-term approach. And managing a trust this complex requires serious governance capacity. I know, but it's the right approach. Then let's make it happen." The next step was presenting the plan to the community. Sage arranged a town meeting at the old community hall, sending word through every channel she could think of. She expected maybe 30 people to show up. Nearly 100 arrived, filling every seat and lining the walls. The tension in the room was palpable. This meeting would either unite the community or shatter it completely. Sage stood at the front, her handwritten notes shaking slightly in her hands. Public speaking had never been her strength, but this mattered too much to let fear stop her. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know there's been a lot of talk these past few months. A lot of anger and confusion about the mineral discovery and what it means for our town. Tonight, I want to share what I'm proposing and hear your thoughts." She walked them through the plan, explaining each component as clearly as she could. The community trust structure, the controlled mining operation, the profit distribution focused on long-term development rather than immediate payouts, the governance model that would give everyone a voice in how resources were used. The questions started immediately, and they weren't gentle. "Why should we trust you to make decisions about something this valuable?" asked one of the younger loggers. "You shouldn't," Sage replied. "That's why the trust would have an elected board. I'd be one voice among several, with no more power than anyone else." "What about people who need money now?" Pauline asked. "There are families barely holding on. Can they afford to wait years for this trust to generate returns?" The trust would start creating jobs within 6 months. The mining operation alone would employ at least 20 people. But you're right that it's not an immediate cash solution for everyone, which is why I'm also proposing an emergency fund, using my personal claim fee and initial payments to provide short-term support for families in crisis. Henry Cobb stood up, his face hard. "This is just a way for you to maintain control while looking generous. You're dressing up greed in the language of community benefit. Henry, I could sell the mining rights tomorrow for $3 million and walk away. I'm proposing this specifically because I don't want individual control. I want shared ownership and shared decision-making. Then give us the money directly. Divide the value among everyone in town." "That's true sharing." The room erupted in argument. Some people supported Henry's position. They wanted cash now, wanted personal compensation, wanted what they saw as their fair share. Others saw the merit in Sage's longer-term approach, but had questions about implementation, governance, and whether it could actually work. Virgil finally stood, and the room quieted. He was the elder here, the one whose opinion carried weight. "I've lived in this town my whole life," he said slowly. "Seen good times and bad. Seen the logging companies take their profits and leave nothing behind but scarred land and broke families. What Sage is proposing, it's not perfect, but it's different. It's saying we matter, not just as labor to be exploited, but as people building something that lasts." "Easy for you to say," someone called out. "You've got your pension. Some of us are barely surviving." "That's exactly my point. I've got my pension because I worked for a big company that extracted value from these mountains and gave back just enough to keep us working. Sage is proposing we extract value too, but keep it here, invest it here, build with it here. Maybe that's naive. Maybe it won't work, but maybe it's worth trying something other than the same old pattern that's been failing us for 100 years. The debate continued for 3 hours. Sage answered questions, clarified details, listened to concerns. Slowly, grudgingly, a kind of consensus emerged. Not unanimous support, that was probably impossible, but enough people willing to give the community trust model a chance. Enough people who were tired of the old extractive economy and wanted to try building something different. At the end of the meeting, they agreed to form a planning committee that would work with Teresa Kim to finalize the trust structure. Elections for the governance board would happen in 6 weeks. And in the meantime, Sage would negotiate with mining companies for a service contract rather than a sale. Walking home that night, Sage felt exhausted, but also strangely energized. The meeting hadn't resolved everything. Henry had left angry, several families were still skeptical, and the hard work of actually building the trust lay ahead. But they'd taken the first real step. Over the next few weeks, Sage threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised her. Days were spent in meetings with lawyers, potential mining contractors, environmental consultants, and financial advisors. Evenings were spent with the planning committee, refining the trust structure, developing governance guidelines, planning for contingencies. She barely had time to run the store anymore. Virgil volunteered to help, manning the counters several hours a day. Pauline took over some of the bookkeeping. Even Oliver Finch pitched in, organizing inventory and making deliveries. The community was beginning to organize itself around the possibility of something new, but not everyone was supportive. Henry Cobb became increasingly vocal in his opposition, holding his own meetings where he argued that the trust was a mistake, that Sage was manipulating everyone, that they should demand she sell and distribute the money directly. His influence was limited, but it was real, and it was growing. One night, Sage came home to find her cabin had been broken into again. This time, things were taken. Her laptop with all the trust documents, her personal files, copies of the mining assessments. Nothing that couldn't be replaced, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to sabotage the trust before it could be established. Virgil came over when he heard, his face grave. "This is escalating. Someone's desperate enough to commit crimes. You need to be careful, Sage. Watch your back. Do you know who it is?" "I have suspicions, but proving it is different from knowing it. And accusing someone without proof would just divide the community further." Sage filed a police report, changed her locks, and started keeping copies of important documents with Teresa Kim in Denver. But the break-in had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. This wasn't just about disagreements anymore. Someone was willing to break the law, to stop what she was building. The planning committee met the next day, and she told them what had happened. The reaction was immediate. Anger, concern, and a hardening of resolve. Whatever faction was working against the trust, they'd just unified the supporters more strongly. "We need to move faster," said one of the committee members. "Get the trust legally established, get the contract signed, make this real before someone can stop it." Teresa Kim agreed. "If we push hard, we can have the legal structure finalized within 2 weeks. Board elections can happen immediately after. Once the trust is established and contracts are signed, it becomes much harder to undo." So they accelerated everything. Sage worked 18-hour days, reviewing documents, negotiating terms, making decisions that would affect everyone in Mistwood Ridge for decades. She barely ate, barely slept, running on coffee and determination, and the fear that if she slowed down for even a moment, the opposition would find a way to derail everything. Bram became her anchor through it all. Every evening, no matter how late, she'd spend at least an hour with the donkey, brushing his coat, talking through her worries, drawing strength from his calm presence. He'd led her to the minerals, yes, but more importantly, he'd led her to this moment, to the possibility of building something meaningful from simple beginnings. "We're almost there," she told him one night, leaning against his warm side while stars filled the sky above. "Just a few more days and the trust will be real. We'll have contracts, we'll have governance, we'll have a real chance to make this work." The donkey, as always, offered no commentary, but his steady presence was reassurance enough. The final community meeting before the board elections was scheduled for Saturday. That's when they'd present the completed trust structure, the signed mining contract, and the governance framework. That's when the community would make its final decision: support the trust and elect a board, or reject it and demand Sage pursue individual sale instead. Everything came down to that one meeting. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd risked, everything she hoped to build. And as Saturday approached, Sage realized she'd done everything she could to prepare. The legal framework was solid. The financial projections were sound. The governance model was fair and transparent. She'd been as honest and careful and thoughtful as she knew how to be. Now it was up to the community to decide whether they believed in the vision she'd shared, whether they were willing to take the risk of building something new instead of cashing out on something old. The answer would come soon, and whatever it was, Sage knew she'd live with it because she'd done the right thing as best she understood it. And sometimes that was all you could do. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning that made everything feel possible. Sage woke before dawn, as always, but instead of her usual routine, she found herself unable to stay inside. She walked out to where Bram was standing in the lean-to, his breath making small clouds in the frigid air. "Today's the day," she told him. "Whatever happens tonight, at least we tried." The donkey nuzzled her shoulder, and she stood there for a while, drawing comfort from his solid warmth, watching the sky lighten from black to navy to the pale blue of approaching sunrise. The meeting was set for 7 that evening, which meant an entire day of waiting, of second-guessing, of wondering if she'd done enough or said the right things or made the case clearly enough. She tried to stay busy at the store, but customers who came in all wanted to talk about the meeting, about their opinions, about what they hoped or feared would happen. By afternoon, Sage felt wrung out from the emotional labor of it all. Virgil found her sitting on the back steps, staring at nothing. "You ready?" he asked, settling down beside her. "I don't know. What if I've pushed too hard? What if people think I'm trying to control everything instead of sharing it? What if they see what I see? A woman who found something valuable and decided to do the hardest, most generous thing she could think of. Building something is always harder than selling it. You chose hard. That counts for something. And if Henry's people outvote us, then we'll know the community isn't ready for what you're offering. And you'll have to make a different decision. But Sage, whatever happens tonight, you've already succeeded in something important. You've made people think about what's possible, about what they want this town to be. That conversation alone is valuable." Teresa Kim arrived an hour before the meeting, carrying boxes of documents and presentation materials. Together with Sage and the planning committee, they set up the community hall. Tables at the front displaying the trust charter, the mining contracts, the financial projections. Chairs arranged in rows. A podium with a microphone. All very official, very formal, very unlike anything that usually happened in this casual mountain town. People started arriving early. By 6:30, the hall was packed even fuller than it had been for the first meeting. Sage recognized most faces. People she'd served at the store, families she'd known for decades, newcomers who'd only been in town a few years. They were all here because what she decided would affect them all. She also saw the opposition gathering in the back. Henry and his supporters. Maybe 15 people total, their expressions hard and determined. They'd come to fight. At precisely 7, Sage stepped to the podium. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tonight, we're making a decision about the future of Mistwood Ridge. Not just about minerals or money, but about what kind of community we want to be." She walked them through the completed trust structure, explaining how it would work, who would govern it, how profits would be distributed. Teresa Kim presented the mining contract they'd negotiated, favorable terms that gave the community substantial control while bringing in experienced operators to handle extraction. The planning committee shared specific proposals for how trust revenue would be invested: a business incubation fund, infrastructure improvements, educational scholarships. Then came the questions. They were sharper than before, more skeptical, more challenging. People wanted guarantees she couldn't give, certainty about outcomes that were inherently uncertain. She answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging risks while explaining why she believed the potential benefits were worth it. Finally, Henry Cobb stood up. "I've listened to all of this," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "And it sounds good. It sounds noble and community-minded and fair. But here's what I see. Sage Montclair has found something worth millions, and instead of distributing that wealth directly to the people who've supported her store all these years, she's created a complicated structure that puts her in control of how money gets spent. She's wrapped personal power in the language of generosity." The accusation hung in the air. Several people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Sage took a breath, then spoke carefully. "Henry, I understand your concern, and you're right that this is complicated. But the whole point of the trust structure is to take control away from any single person, including me. I'll be one board member among 7. I'll have one vote. If the community wants to elect a board that excludes me entirely, that's their right. This isn't about my control. It's about all of us having a say in our collective future." "Then prove it," Henry said. "Put the question to a vote right now. Not about whether to form the trust that's already decided by your legal maneuvering, but about who should be on the board. Let the people choose. And if they don't choose you, will you step aside?" It was a challenge, and a clever one. If Sage refused, she'd appear to be seeking power. If she agreed, she risked losing her seat on the very project she'd created. She looked out at the faces staring back at her, some supportive, some hostile, most just uncertain, and trying to make sense of complicated choices. "Yes," she said, "let the people choose. If this community wants to build a trust without me on the board, I'll support that decision. This is bigger than any one person. It always has been." The voting process was simple. Each adult resident of Mistwood Ridge could nominate up to 7 people for the trust board. The top 7 vote-getters would serve 2-year terms. Ballots were distributed, nominations were called out and written down, and then people marked their choices in the privacy of a voting booth set up in the corner. Sage stood near the back of the room while people voted, watching the line move slowly forward, seeing conversations happen in hushed tones, seeing factions form and dissolve. This was democracy in its rawest form, messy, uncertain, driven by relationships and grievances and hopes that might or might not align with anyone's careful planning. Virgil came to stand beside her. "Whatever happens, you did right, did I? Or did I just make everything more complicated? Sometimes complicated is the price of doing something." Worthwhile, the votes were counted by a volunteer committee that included both Sage's supporters and Henry's. It took almost an hour to tabulate everything. During that time, the room buzzed with nervous energy. People speculated, debated, second-guessed their choices. Finally, the committee chair, a retired teacher named Phyllis, who'd been neutral throughout the whole process, stepped to the podium with the results for the first board of the Mistwood Ridge community. "Trust," she announced. "The 7 members elected by this community are—" She read the names slowly, letting each one settle before moving to the next. Virgil Brennan, no surprise there. The elder statesman everyone trusted. Pauline Driscoll, a surprise to Sage. But Pauline had proven herself loyal when it mattered. Oliver Finch, controversial. But people recognized his connection to the original discovery and his recent honesty. 3 others from the planning committee, all solid choices who'd earned respect through their work over the past weeks. And then the 7th name, Sage Montclair. Relief and validation flooded through her so strongly she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. The community had chosen her. Not unanimously. The vote count showed she'd gotten 63 votes out of 112 cast, a solid majority, but not overwhelming. But enough. Enough to say that more people trusted her vision than doubted it. Henry's face went rigid. He'd received 48 votes himself. Strong support, but not enough to secure a seat. The message was clear. The community wanted both voices represented on the board, but they'd chosen Sage's approach over his. "This is a mistake," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're all going to regret trusting her. When this falls apart, when the promises don't materialize, remember that I warned you." He walked out, and about 10 people followed him. But the vast majority stayed, and when Phyllis asked for a vote on whether to formally establish the trust as chartered, hands rose throughout the room. The vote was 79 in favor, 18 opposed, 15 abstaining. The Mistwood Ridge Community Trust was real. The newly elected board convened immediately at the front of the hall for their first official meeting. It was brief, mostly just signing the charter documents and agreeing to meet again in 3 days to begin the real work. But the symbolism was important. 7 people from this community, given authority by their neighbors, committing to build something together. After the meeting ended and people began filtering out, several came up to Sage to offer congratulations or express cautious support. A few who'd voted against her made a point of shaking her hand anyway, saying they hoped it would work, even if they had doubts. It was civil, respectful, adult, the kind of disagreement that strengthened a community instead of destroying it. Pauline was the last to approach. "You surprise me," she said bluntly. "I didn't think you had this in you. Running a store, sure. But building something this ambitious, taking on this much risk, I underestimated you." "I underestimated myself," Sage admitted. "Still am, honestly." "This is terrifying." "Good means you're taking it seriously." Pauline paused, then added, "I voted for you because 35 years ago, when my husband got hurt and we had no money, you gave us 6 months of supplies on credit and never said a word about it to anyone. That's the kind of person I want making decisions about community money. Someone who's already proven they care more about people than profit." After everyone left, Sage stood alone in the empty hall surrounded by the remnants of the meeting, scattered papers, pushed back chairs, the physical evidence of democracy in action. Teresa Kim came up beside her. "You did it. Against significant odds, with substantial opposition, you actually built consensus for community ownership. That's remarkable. We did it, all of us. This was never about me alone, maybe, but it started with you making a choice, taking a risk, believing something better was possible. Never underestimate how rare that is." Walking home that night under a sky full of stars, Sage felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace, not certainty. There were still 1,000 things that could go wrong, 1,000 challenges ahead, but peace in knowing she'd done what felt right, and the community had chosen to walk that path with her. Bram was waiting in the lean-to, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his rough coat. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight, for just a few hours, she'd let herself feel the simple satisfaction of having tried something hard and succeeded." 6 months later, autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sage stood on the porch of her cabin, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over peaks that had become so familiar they felt like old friends. The air carried the first real cold of the season, a warning that winter was coming and the community needed to be ready. But this year, for the first time in a long time, Mistwood Ridge felt ready for anything. The mining operation had begun in August. employing 23 local people with fair wages and safe conditions. The trust's first revenue payments had come through last month, and while they weren't enormous yet, they were real, enough to fund the business incubation program that had already helped 3 families start small enterprises. Enough to begin repairs on the community hall and the old schoolhouse. Enough to prove the concept worked. More importantly, the trust had changed the conversation in town. Instead of arguing about who deserved what share of Sage's discovery, people were talking about what they could build together. Instead of resentment and division, there was cautious optimism and genuine collaboration. It wasn't perfect. Henry Cobb had left town entirely, moving down to the valley where he'd found work with a different timber company. A handful of families who'd wanted immediate cash payments rather than long-term investment had also relocated, disappointed that the trust couldn't provide the instant wealth they'd hoped for. And there were still skeptics who believed the whole thing would eventually collapse under the weight of its own ambition. But most people had stayed, and most of them were working to make the trust succeed. The store had transformed along with everything else. Sage still ran it, but now she had help. A young couple who'd moved back to town specifically because the trust made Mistwood Ridge feel viable again. They'd taken over most of the day-to-day operations, while Sage focused on her board responsibilities. The arrangement worked well. The store was actually profitable now, and Sage had more time to devote to the larger community work. Virgil had become the trust's unofficial conscience, the one who asked the hard questions in board meetings and made sure they never lost sight of their original values. Pauline, surprisingly, had emerged as the financial pragmatist, the one who insisted on solid accounting and realistic projections. Oliver worked as a historical consultant for the mining operation, his knowledge of his grandfather's work proving genuinely valuable. Together, the board had developed a working rhythm, not always agreeing, but always working towards shared goals. The morning after that first board meeting, Sage had come out to feed Bram and found a small brass nameplate had been attached to his shelter. It read, "Bram, the donkey who changed everything." She'd asked around and eventually learned that Virgil had commissioned it from a metal worker in the valley. The gesture had moved her more than she could say. Now Bram was something of a local celebrity. Children came to visit him, bringing carrots and apples, asking to hear the story of how he'd led Sage to the minerals. Adults stopped by too, treating him with the kind of affectionate respect you'd give a founding member of the community. He accepted it all with patient dignity, as if he'd known all along how things would turn out. Sage's own life had settled into a new normal that felt both strange and right. She still woke at 4:30, still walked the path between cabin and store, still served coffee to familiar faces. But now those faces looked at her differently, not with resentment or expectation, but with something closer to partnership. She was still Sage, still the shopkeeper, but also something more, the woman who'd been given extraordinary luck and chosen to share it rather than hoard it. Her daughter had visited last month, bringing the grandchildren for a week. Walking them around town, Sage had felt a swell of pride, showing them what the community was building. This is what's possible, she'd told them, when people decide to work together instead of competing for scraps. The hardest part had been learning to accept help. All her life, Sage had been the one who helped others, who solved problems, who carried burdens quietly without complaint. Now people brought her meals when she worked late, checked in on her, offered assistance without being asked. It felt uncomfortable at first, like receiving something she hadn't earned. But slowly she'd learned that accepting help was its own kind of generosity. It let other people feel capable and needed and connected. On this autumn morning, with winter approaching and the Trust's first successful season behind them, Sage allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The journey from that spring day, when Oliver traded her a worthless donkey, to this autumn morning, had been harder than anything she'd imagined. But it had also been worth it. She finished her coffee and walked out to the lean-to where Bram was already awake, ears forward, waiting for breakfast. His grey coat had thickened for winter, and under regular feeding he'd filled out into a solid, healthy animal who bore little resemblance to the scrawny creature she'd accepted in trade. "Morning, friend," she said, scratching behind his ears the way he liked. "Ready for another day?" The donkey leaned into her touch, and Sage felt that familiar sense of gratitude for whatever strange chain of circumstances had brought him into her life. The minerals had made her wealthy, yes, but Bram had given her something more valuable: the courage to imagine a different kind of future and the companionship to sustain her through the struggle of building it. Inside the store, she could see the lights coming on as her employees arrived to start their day. Soon customers would begin arriving, the coffee would start brewing, and the ordinary business of a mountain community would resume. But now that ordinary business was infused with possibility, with the knowledge that they were building something that might actually last. Sage gave Bram his breakfast, locked up the cabin and headed toward the store. The morning was cold and bright, full of the kind of clarity that only came at this altitude, in this season. In this place she'd chosen as home 35 years ago. Some people spent their whole lives looking for the one moment that would change everything, she thought. She'd been content just to survive, to endure, to make it through each day with a little dignity intact. And then a desperate man had offered her a trade that everyone said was foolish: a scrawny donkey for valuable supplies. The worst deal anyone could imagine. Except it had led to everything. Sometimes the best things in life really did come when you stopped looking for them. When you just did the next right thing, made the next kind choice, showed the next bit of compassion to a stranger in need, and sometimes a worthless donkey turned out to be worth more than all the minerals in the mountains. The real treasure had never been the money. It had been the reminder that one person's simple act of generosity could transform an entire community, if they were brave enough to share what they'd been given instead of keeping it for themselves. Sage opened the store, turned on the lights and started the coffee brewing. Outside the window, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But inside this small building, in this tiny town, in the lives of people who'd been given a chance to build something better, everything had changed. And it had all started with a trade nobody else would take: the foolish woman and the worthless donkey. Together, they'd made each other rich beyond measure.